Hello and welcome to this Roundtable podcast from the Centre for Contemporary Art, Derry Londonderry. I'm Catherine Hemelryk, CCA's director, and I'm very pleased to introduce artists Bojana Janković, Vukašin Nedeljković, and Justin Kuoame. Bojana Janković describes herself as an artist and immigrant occupying the immigration regime between London and Belfast, and was one of three artists in CCA's exhibition Ballads of Rhinestones and Newcomers, where she highlighted the everyday experience of an invisible yet hard border for migrants on the island of Ireland. And she's one of the founders of the Migrants in Culture network. Vukašin Nedeljković is an artist and activist based in Dublin and initiator of the multidisciplinary project Asylum Archive. The project began when he started documenting the direct provision in Ireland while he was waiting for the results of his asylum application. It has grown to become a platform for dialogue and an online resource, a point for collaboration and discussion inclusive to individuals who have experienced social trauma and violence and a sense of sociological and geographical displacement. Having come to Northern Ireland from the Ivory Coast, Justin Kuoame has held a number of positions during his time in NI. He was formerly chair of the Northern Ireland Community of Refugees and Asylum Seekers and a member of the Northern Ireland Council for Ethnic Minorities, and is one of the newly appointed commissioners, Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission. He is also an artist and last year one of the first recipients of Arts Council of Northern Ireland's SIAP Minority Ethnic Residency and Mentoring Programme. This roundtable is made possible thanks to the support of Arts Council of Northern Ireland, Derry City and Strabane District Council and the Art Fund. So, I want to start by asking each of you, in my homage to Matt Everett, when were you first aware of art? Bojana.
I have a pretty, unremarkable story. I don't know that it has to be remarkable, but I actually, given the fact that I mostly spend my times and my practice mostly lives in gallery spaces and public spaces now, it occurs to me that my first I remember art moment was actually in theater. I'm incredibly lucky that my parents, probably in an effort to continue having a life, just took me everywhere. And from when I was a child, this included a lot of grown-up theater. And I was growing up in 1990s Yugoslavia, and it was all very depressing and very sad. But I have a distinct memory of being about 8, maybe 7 or 8, in this very small theater in Belgrade, watching what I later discovered was a hugely inappropriate performance to take a 7-year-old to. But I just remember being completely mesmerized. It was one of those childhood moments. They used a lot of walnuts as a prop in the performance. I stole a walnut afterwards from the stage because it was a really small stage and decided then and there I indeed would dedicate my life to theater, which I did for a while because I did go on to study theater directing after some meandering. But I just remember that being the first time where somehow the complete, as I said, inappropriateness of what I was watching actually washed over me because I remember the actor. I remember what was happening on stage. It was just incredible to me that I could be at such close proximity to it. I just wanted to be it and do it. So that's my first. I have some vague memories of being in other theater and performance spaces and galleries before then, but that's the first time I remember experiencing stuff as opposed to just being in a space.
Vukašin, what about you?
I don't think I can recall the moment when I was first made aware of art, as I think that living in exile or forever exile, memory loss is something that is kind of embedding me still. But I remember clearly when I remembered art, and it was a crucial moment of departure for me as a existence in Ireland. And that was the moment when I sought a refuge in Ireland and applying for international protection. And I was living in one of the direct provision centers in Ireland, which are the accommodation center or dispersal scheme for people looking for protection. And I remember I was living in a small town in Ballyhollis in rural Ireland in the room 20 24, and I was struggling a lot. And there was the moment of revelation, as such, as I kind of realized that it's still in my bag was that small Olympus camera that had at the time 5 megapixels that my dad put in my bag and said, well, you never know how this may be of use. And that's how it started. And that was the origin of the Asylum Archive and a coping mechanism that I am really grateful to that small camera. It almost saved my life.
And Justin, for you?
Yes, I started really doing art because in Ivory Coast, like West Africa, in college you do art, but I started doing portraiture when I was in university. My flatmate was studying fine art, so I was curious to know exactly what he was doing all the time, how he could draw, look at a photo and then draw the same people onto a paper using charcoal. And so I said to me, no, it's easy to do. He said, yes, that's what I would like to try. So he prepped the paper for me. At that time, you have to prep the paper, doing some squares and do the squares as well on the photo, put on the photo. And then I started doing my parent first. And then I thought, and then he finished it for me. And I was very, intrigued in how to reproduce someone's face from photo to a paper and look very similar. I said, okay, let me try to, start doing it. So I started doing family members first. And when I came here in 2009, I through the asylum process, like my colleague Vukašin, it was very, challenging, difficult thing to do, waiting for asylum decision and the process. Then a lovely lady I knew volunteer from Nikras. When I said to her, because she does a lot of landscape painting for free, she donated. And I said, I know I can draw, She said, yes. So she bought me a pack of pencil and gave me a paper, a block of paper. So when I finished Nikras, I go home. And then I started going back to the basics, start doing like the eyes, the nose, because I haven't done it for a long time, starting slowly. And this is how for me it became therapeutic. So I go and do all my engagement as a chair. When I came home, when I can't sleep, then I'll sit down and start drawing. And this is how it developed. And then when I moved to Simon Community, the staff noticed I was trying to do some art. And my support worker, she has a master in fine art, and then she has her own practice by working for Simon Community. So she spoke to the manager and they provide me with some stuff. But I never used a watercolor before. So for me, it was the cheapest option. In my situation, my condition, graphite and watercolor were very cheap for me to get. So this is how I start learning how to use watercolor, and this is how I really start with art. But I learned from back home many years ago. But then the situation here, to deal with the hardship of the immigration process, I went back. But to be honest, maybe after 2 weeks, this article came out, I have a lot of friends. People I know, they don't even know I can draw or I can paint. They have no idea, because something I kept secret. I don't really talk about it. I just came home and do my thing and stock it somewhere. And then it was a bit of a surprise for people to see me like, oh, Justin, I saw you in the newspaper. I didn't know you could do it. I said, yeah, I've been doing this for a long time. So that's my story of art.
So for any listeners who may not be aware, you can actually Google Justin and find a rather fantastic interview with him in the Belfast Telegraph. Bojana, you came to visual arts via sort of performance, and tell me about it.
I think I went to what in the UK would be called drama school. I studied theatre directing, and then I felt a real urge by the end of it to escape the hierarchies of theatre. And when I came to the UK, to London, I did a degree and a master's in performance making, which was kind of performance arty. And I think over the last 10, 12 years, it's been a slow removal from classic theatre spaces into gallery spaces and performance art. So I actually rather no, I did not go to an art school. I went to a drama school.
And how soon did you become an activist, or were you always quite active politically?
I don't know how to answer that question. I've been going to protests for as long as I could escape my parents' attention, I think, because unfortunately that was the time that I grew up in, and the country and the politics of it. So I think a lot of my, I don't know, childhood, early years was spent in not really political activism, but definitely political action. I think when I came to the UK, and again, I just want to be clear, I came on a student visa. That's like a very privileged route to follow. But I think when I came to the UK, immediately I became, politically speaking, a migrant, and immediately the hostile environment, which was not called a hostile environment at the time, but definitely existed in terms of wanting to not to make the UK less friendly and open to people who were not from the UK, it immediately became a factor in my life. I think I struggle with this use of the word activism because I'm never sure. I always feel like, oh, there's more stuff I could be doing and should be doing. But I think I can't vote. I have very little political speech options available to me as a migrant. I also don't particularly feel comfortable, and I haven't for a really long time, going to protests and demonstrations in the UK because of the British legislation that has only gone worse over the last year. There could be serious repercussions for me in terms of my visa status if I so much as talked to a police officer at a protest. So I think I have felt my right to free speech and right to protest curtailed by my migrant existence in the country and limited to a certain degree. And so I think I have, over the years, tried to find a way that felt as safe as possible in terms of my ability to continue living here, but that still exists within that realm of fighting for migrant rights and migrant activism. And I think that's something that I share with quite a lot of people I've known over the years who felt that their political speech or their activism has had to morph away from how they used to practice it in different spaces because of what they stand to lose, right? And I think anyone who doesn't have citizenship, and in the UK with the new immigration law, even people who do have citizenship is in that position. I remember once an American artist who's also done a lot of activist work saying, like one of the reasons I moved to the UK was the NHS. And before I became a citizen, I dare not be anywhere within a sight, because he had medical issues, within sight of police for fear that I would have to go back to a land of no NHS. So I think for a lot of migrants in the UK, and it'd be interesting to hear how it differs in Ireland, but for a lot of migrants in the UK, there's this real balance between what I can do and how I can do it. And I think, and I'll finish this rambling thought now, I think that's why I started doing a lot of art projects that in my head blur this line between art and activism, because somehow you gain legitimacy and you feel safer, not legitimacy for yourself, but suddenly it starts being read as art practice if you're doing it within a gallery space. And I felt like it was much safer for a really long time, and continues to be, to a certain extent, to practice migrant activism within cultural institutions than it is out and about very, very frequently.
Vukašin, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
So my thoughts on that, well, personally, the work that I have been doing since 2007, which is Asylum Archive, and it's a visual representation or documentation of the direct provision in Ireland, has been anonymous for a very long time. And I didn't reveal my identity, particularly in the time when I was stateless for almost 10 years. And literally when I was very fortunate to become an Irish citizen, and I think the citizenship is kind of really important in this discourse, I decided to kind of personalize the work that I've been doing, and it was really much easier in terms of communication with an art world, if you like, or academic world, to have a name. But again, we are reaching that point at the moment that I am trying to depersonalize it now for the various reasons. So, but in terms of, I have been very much vocal, in particularly in terms how Ireland does treat people who come to their shores to seek international protection, in terms of injustices, in terms of human rights abuses, in terms of continuous incarceration, and at times when I haven't been penalized, and I am feeling that I will may not be penalized, if you like, now when I have a status. if you know what I mean, because there is a huge difference. But absolutely, there is a thing that people who are still incarcerated, they speak, some of them do speak, but in general, people are afraid to speak. People are afraid to attend protests, as in this case, really what the state does is creating this system where a system of deportability. I think that's the main fear of people in the system, to speak out because they're afraid of deportations or perhaps transfers to a different center, which has a huge repercussions on their children, for example, going to local schools or they're volunteering or even having a job. So there is that notion, but I think it's really individual. If that's going to respond, Bojana, to what you were saying earlier?
Yeah, I guess it does. Can I ask you a very specific question? How does it? I first encountered your work in Ima, so that's quite some time ago. But I remember I was just a tourist walking around Ima, and then first I was attracted to photo, and at the time I was finding myself in a situation where my work, which was about the migrant experience, or very specifically, I think, Eastern European experience in England, was programmed a lot for a variety of structurally problematic reasons, alongside art that was about the refugee experience and almost never by people with experiences of the asylum system. And so I remember just immediately recognizing the image, and then just spending a lot of time thinking about the absence. I know this is the basis of your work, but thinking about the absence of people in these photos, and how much was said in that absence about the asylum seeking process, about direct provision specifically, but also I think generally more internationally about the asylum seeking process. But I'm just wondering how that change was for you, as both a person who went through that process and went through the experiences of asylum seeking and direct provision, but also as an artist, to go from feeling unable to share your name publicly as a person that is, to a person who is now, from what I can see, and please correct me if I'm wrong, artistically, institutionally, extremely established within the national context in Ireland. And I just wonder, that must have been such a huge and possibly not the easiest of shifts, I presume.
No, absolutely. Are you referring to the exhibition IMA, the Narrow Gate Here and Now? Have you seen the last year? Am I correct?
So there was the last year, but I remember because, we're from, I'm going to say from the same country, maybe. I remember, I saw the name, recognizing the name, actually some years ago. I'm going to say, is it possible 6-7 years ago that I saw something? Because I remember ages ago seeing your name somewhere and seeing the images. So I don't know if those timelines shift, but yes, I saw the most recent one.
There has been some kind of progress, really, particularly that time, 7-8 years ago, but it wasn't IMA. So indeed, can I just reflect on this for a second? It took me literally 10 years, right, from the moment when I was in the system, to be accepted to show the work within the White Cube context. It was a really, really slow process, Bojana. And I actually embedded the journey into academia, started a PhD only for the reason to be able to show my work at the conferences through PowerPoint presentations. And that's how the work existed. So IMA literally, I think, came a bit as a miracle. And then it kind of shifted loads of things, right, as you were kind of saying that. So it's really important. And I think that's what really was fascinating about IMA, was the communication with the curator, Sean Kisson, was a really pleasant, wonderful experience. And I haven't been ever thinking that the work is going to look really that well and good in terms of visual representation in one room. And I think this is not the only avenue for the work to be displayed, but it's one of. And I was really, really pleased about that. But I think that kind of multimodality of the work, where the work can exist in a various different discourses, is extremely important. For me, it's really a struggle still, but keep the struggle going. I think that's the notion of it.
Can I ask, Justin, you a question? It's similarly to Vukašin. I'm wondering, I know that you went through the asylum process in the UK, but I also know that however you think about your art, I know that you were funded by Arts Council Northern Ireland, and that's kind of in Northern Ireland, it's the institution for art. And I'm wondering, do you think about art that you make as work? Do you think about it as something else? And how do you see this relationship between the work that you're doing for migrant and refugee rights and the art practice? Does that make sense as a question?
Yes, it does. First of all, the art for me and the way I'm doing it now is like more than therapy. I'm using it as a therapy for all those, mental, because going through the process till now, it's difficult for me to sleep early. I can't sleep early. I sleep very early in the morning, like 2, 3 o'clock. I force myself to sleep at 3. So using the art for me is a therapy. Then my activism side started when I was in uni back home, university, student union. Then when I came here and I look at the country, and there was a big understanding around asylum seeking process, why people come here, why they don't stay in the country, all these type of things. So I, as a chair of NICRAS, we wanted to let people know there are people here who were seeking asylum, protection, because there were a lot of people didn't know, even in Northern Ireland, someone can come here and seek refuge. So going through this process, and I understood some people were very compassionate, they understood the plight, some people were very against. So my activism, I decided strategically to target policymakers, to engage with politicians, because that's where for me, the problem lied at the time, because some of them, if you live in Northern Ireland, you understand the political aspect of the game here. But for me, it was very important to get politicians understand why people come here, the reason why people come to seek protection here, and it's going to help us because they are the lawmakers. For example, here, before, asylum seekers were not allowed to, learning English was not free. You have to pay to learn English. How can you, an asylum seeker receiving at the time £35, maybe it's at 37.50 something now, how can someone receiving this money every week can pay for his own course? So to get this type of policy change in application, you have to target politicians. So this is how we, made reference, explain things to get free English classes for asylum seekers and so on, even access to gym, paying the same amount, like £1 at a time, like people on benefits, so many things. So for me, at the present moment, I use it as a therapy. I will do my art, when I go and come, is a way of building, getting strength. Maybe tomorrow it will be a night form of activism. If I'm able to translate this activism into my art, it will be good, because to be honest, like I said, I never learned art at school. I learned it on the go from my friend and myself. So it's not difficult for me to say, let me find a film, and then start to develop a body of art. I think this is for people like you who study and have some knowledge. But for me now, recently I started doing some landscape and abstract art. So I usually focus on portraiture. I have mostly family members as well, friends. So maybe in the future, if I have an idea or I think of something as a former activist, and I can translate into a body of art to say, this shows this. But at the moment, it's not the way I proceed.
So, Justin, you were a recipient of an Arts Council grant not so long ago. And in the article interview with you, it talked about how transformative that support was. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, there was this minority fund for residency from the Art Council. And I saw it, and a friend of mine told me, the person who was telling me didn't even know I do art. We were talking about BME issues, Black and ethnic minority issues. And she mentioned the funding. So we were talking about the funding. I said, okay. So I went to look at the application, and they had a session on Zoom. But when I looked into the application, there was a criteria where you had to have a practice for you to get this funding. So because I went to the Zoom information section, when I asked the question, someone like myself, I do not have a practice, but I have a lot of body of art. By that time, I had about 20 portraits around in my room. So, and I explained to them, like, there's a lot of people in the side of the world I am in, refugees who do art, but they're not engaging with the art community here. So how can they have a practice? How can they establish a practice if they're not known? And I was pleasantly surprised by the Art Council director and the people of the Art Council were very pleased to say, just say, you know what, I think you're making a good point. We're going to look at it. So don't please submit your application and explain this the way you explain it. So this is how I was able to pass this barrier of having a practice before you have the grant. So it was very helpful because, like I explained in the beginning, I started using graphite and watercolor. These are the things I could afford at the time. So by having this £5,000, and I did the budget for what I wanted to buy acrylic, because I wanted to start with acrylic. And I was not confident with oil. Then I was able to buy a lot of canvases, buy a lot of acrylic paint, and this is when then I started using proper acrylic paint to put on paper. And for me, it was big because I was able to, to make the body of work bigger. So then today, maybe this week I use watercolor, next week I do acrylic paint, and then I start doing some abstract as well and landscaping. So because I have a lot of canvases, I have a lot of material to play around. So it was very detrimental on how my art developed. So now I have my own studio at home. I'm trying to find a place where I can put my art, sit down. So it's very important, at least like Bojana said at the beginning. Now I know I can focus, find a theme and start producing some art based on the theme I created. It really gave me a lot of freedom, a lot of opportunity to experience different medium, but as well build my confidence.
I want to ask Vukašin about how it is in the South. Are there routes for people who are going through the systems to access support, or is it utterly different?
I'm not really familiar with the Northern Ireland system, but I think it may be very similar, if not the same. I would like to outline something different here, and I'll come back to your question, Catherine. I think it's, and this doesn't have to really imply only for people who are seeking protection or refuge, who are coming from outside of Ireland, in Ireland to seek refuge. I think personally, I had this kind of immense desire to do the work, and in the time when I was still in the process, for the 10 years, I did the majority of the work that is still the body of asylum market without any funding. And I think it's really important to outline that the work can be done without the funding. I think it's really important to outline that artists shouldn't be waiting for funding to conduct their work. I think funding really came, the first funding came from Create, which is an agency for the collaborative arts in Ireland. When I was given 10,000 euros as an award that I applied for, it was Artist in Activism. And at the time, and I was kind of remember looking at that, so what will I do now? The work is almost completed. It was a couple of years ago, so what will I do with all that money? I'm not really used to have money from the work I've been doing. And then I decided to create a book, really, or to publish the book Asylum Market, and that's how it came about. There has been significant progress in the last couple of years within Arts Council and Create and Fire Station Studios in terms of devising a particular support system and the grants for people who are, let's say, in direct provision, for people who are migrants, for people who are travelers. So I think that's really, really kind of slowly unfolding and happening, yet it's really, really far from what it should be in the first place. But I think Arts Council, with the new director, it's making a huge progress. And I think me being around, it's always good, and the comrades as well, just to say, like, hold on a second, that's, you may need to have people from who are, may not be white, or, who are still in the asylum process, and etc. So I think it's on the rise, as well as having kind of studio residencies as well available for people who are still in the asylum process. So I think it's, better than it was.
Can I add something to that? Yeah, I'm just thinking about the ways that different funding infrastructure support people with experience of migration. And I I don't know who I am to say this. I think my opinion in this case is irrelevant, but I think we should strive for conditions of funding whenever possible, because I think I lived in England for about 10 years before I moved to Northern Ireland, where there's much more money than in Northern Ireland for art funding and art subsidy. And what happens is people with experiences of migration of all kinds, including seeking protection, get excluded structurally from funding systems because we don't know how to navigate a system, because we were not born into that system. We frequently didn't go to schools that teach us how to navigate that system. And what happens is that usually white British middle-class people then get to make art about what it's like to be a migrant or a refugee, etc. And that creates this really problematic circle of detrimental representation at the very least. And I think I work as part of Migrants in Culture. We work at an intersection of arts and culture and migrant justice movements and local governance. In the cultural sector in the UK, which is devolved, we try to organize conditions of safety for everyone from migrant background for a cultural sector where migrant communities can thrive instead of being kind of marginalized and excluded. And what we have found over and over again is an institutional awareness of needs of anyone with experiences of migrancy, and an awareness of how the systems that these institutions see as supportive are actually being exclusive of migrants or anyone with a migration background. And so I think, I don't know that it's the job of migrant artists or people, definitely not artists with experiences of going through the asylum system, to, figure out the systems that are needed. But I think in the UK, definitely, I have found the need to speak up about how existing cultural infrastructure is just another layer of the hostile environment for everyone with a migrant background. My work has been in some pretty large institutions and pretty big institutions, and it all sounds great. The bigger the institutions, the more hostile the HR department, who will bang on my doors until I send them what they think is appropriate documentation as my right to work in the UK. But of course, they are not specialists in a myriad kind of different work permits that exist. And so they are very likely to not understand that what I have allows me to work and to practice, and different visas have different limitations in terms of whether you're allowed to do freelance work, how many hours a week outside of different things that you're doing. So whether you can be employed or self-employed and so on and so forth. So I think there is also the who gets to make the art, and then there are the structures around it that maybe sometimes facilitate the further exclusion of people who may or may not be present in galleries and theatres and venues and so on. And I think the thing that exists in Northern Ireland that Justin was talking about, which is relatively new, I think it's now in its second year, as a specific strand of funding for a migrant and artists of colour, is definitely something that, I could also speak about how there are problems with how they talk about it and what they do, but at the same time, it's not something that exists in England, where you will be told that migrancy is not a protected category and therefore it doesn't count towards any kind of quote unquote diversity funding, and where there is no sense of feeling about how arts funding structures, as I said, a further layer of marginalization for people from with lived experiences of migrancy.
Yeah, 100%. I would agree. And I think this is really important to have people who are experiencing or have experienced the system of incarceration, whether it's in Ireland or it's in Northern Ireland or it's anywhere in Europe, in terms of speaking through art, if possible, about that experience, as I believe strongly that representation of the refugee-ness by people who have not experienced it and people who have did the work on refugees has been really detrimental, in my view, in visual arts, in the representation of that notion in, let's say, in the White Cube galleries, in the different biennales, etc. And I'm often thinking about the work of, in Irish context, the work of Richard Moss, Mark Quinn, etc., who have really been kind of not aware of particularly ethics. And I think this is really crucially important, of the representation in that sense. So the more we have the voices from people who have embedded that system, and I think that's really, really crucial, and to challenge that kind of establishment that does not serve what I strongly believe is the reality of people who are living in the system.
Yeah, I'd like to add something as well regarding what Vukašin said and Bojana said as well. When, especially Vukašin, when you're into this asylum process, your whole thought is on how the determination of your application your asylum application. Everything else becomes secondary. So sometimes it's very difficult for artists or any other professional when they're going through this process to be able to express themselves as an artist or as a teacher or whatever they have, because your main concern is the determination of your asylum application. And sometimes after this coming out, so the asylum process, maybe 4 years, 2 years, 12 years, 13 years, there's something vanish. You lose some of this artistic value or what you were doing before. So that's why if the art, like Bojana said, those funding or those extra help for BME, especially those, in the refugee or asylum process help, because at least it brings you back this love for your art. It brings you back the opportunity to focus, because after spending like a couple of years in this process, which in my case, I've been doing it in my room, I come and I do, and then when I got this funding, I said, wow, this now I can do big body of art, I can expand what I used to do. Then I stopped straight away using graphite, I started using acrylic. But if I didn't get this funding, I was going to be in the same place, and that's why sometimes making access to those funding is very important for those who came to the asylum process or BME or people or migrant. It gives them the opportunity to expand, because if you move here as a new migrant, you have so many things to try to find out. You don't have time to focus on art sometimes unless you get and then someone somewhere to help you. That's what I wanted to add to this.
I really think of all this art infrastructure as part of the structure of citizenship. And I think this idea that Justin was talking about of losing something of yourself and your passion or your ability to do your work as you go through various processes of asylum or migrancy and so on. I really think it's part of the practice of citizenship to be able to partake in artistic infrastructure, such as the infrastructure funding, for example. And I don't just mean citizenship in the sense of I have a passport. I just mean citizenship as in active participation in a society of a country we live in. And so I think it's also up to places like Arts Council of Northern Ireland or Ireland or other countries, places like galleries, like museums, like theatres and so on, to actually actively think about how they are not facilitating the practice of citizenship for different people who might be migrants, who may have gone through the asylum process, who may have different ways of being excluded outside of this from cultural infrastructure. And part of the extreme problem that we have in the UK, at least, and again, always curious to hear what it's like in Ireland, because so close yet so far away from where I am at the moment. But part of the problem that we have is the people, for the most part, people who are leading those institutions are so far removed from those experiences of marginalization that it is not within their realm of thinking that they need to facilitate the practice of citizenship for some people. And at the same time, in the UK it's devolved, so in different countries that make up the UK, there are different pressures from arts councils that don't come from devolved or Westminster government about how to distribute funding, and 12 years of Tory government, and in Northern Ireland a complete absence of continuous government has not helped. They have created pressures where, in England, you just have to count people. You just manically need to count how many people come to each exhibition, and then you have to prove that those people fit certain categories. And we count diversity in England. They count diversity for the most part. So if you can prove there were 53 women, and that's more than men, then you've ticked out the diversity box and we can move on to the next one. And if you don't have a box for your experience, then institutions will not think about it. So I just want to return back and actually want to ask you, Catherine, as a person in charge of an art institution, I want to ask you how you think of this intersection between migrancy and the space that you curate and think about, because I have to say that my experience of meeting you, knowing you and working with the CCA has really stood out in that sense that I didn't have to figure out how my story works for you as a curator so that you would find it within your realm, which is often what I think as a migrant artist you have to do. You have to figure out how to translate what you want to talk about to people who are completely removed from this experience so that they would grant you an opportunity to practice this kind of citizenship. But I think with you, I've really had the experience of you coming to me after I spoke for 5 minutes or 10 minutes, 20 minutes and saying, I would like to do something about this, which thank you, amazing. But I'm just wondering how you as a person who curates a gallery thinks about this relationship. What do you think is the gallery's role in terms of enabling different levels of citizenship, including for migrants?
Sure. So I think my approach to programming partly is informed by when I was growing up. For example, women weren't directors, women weren't getting solo shows. There was a massive, just on a very simple level of gender, women weren't as visible as men. So from very young, I always wanted to be the change you want to see. And so the second I got a chance to start programming spaces, it was just like, right, I want gender parity as well as gender non-conforming artists, and who else hasn't been visible, and trying to be very mindful about who isn't usually visible. And with that, I'm very keen that CCA is a platform for different voices. We're also very artist-centered, so I try my best to see who's making work, what makes for an interesting program, what resonates with our space, what resonates with our audiences, who are much more diverse than I think certainly the the English media paint Northern Irish populations to be, because it's never been just themans and themans. That's just not representative historically. It's not representative now. So what we have in an art space is that opportunity to share different perspectives and to give that platform to your voice in hopefully a visually stunning, gripping way, which perhaps is a very simplistic answer, but I think my role is having the imagination to meet artists, see how they work, know our space, know our context, and see what could happen, and to be able to create something that hopefully it can be, I want to say the word nutritious, but that's a terrible word to use, but at least that's my very simplistic approach. But thank you very much for the compliments. That's very, very lovely to hear. But I've really enjoyed learning about your practice, and it's been really great to see how it's been able to mean a lot to the people who come into our gallery as well.
And Vukašin, can you tell us a bit about what it's like in Ireland in terms of, you've mentioned a couple of artists who are detrimental to inclusion and representation of asylum experiences. Are there any good practices? Like, what works in Ireland for you as an artist? What is it that works? Who are the people doing the interesting, good, inclusive work? What should we try and figure out as a practice that we can steal from the South and bring to the North, maybe?
No, absolutely. And I didn't really get to kind of maybe chance to unpack that kind of detrimental and I really kind of attitude. And I really think this is coming from the position of not knowing and a position of the power. And I mean, the power is the white power, right? Or even the white supremacy. And this is really coming from the notion that the white privileged middle class men, okay, widely established, like Richard Moss did represent Ireland at the Venice Biennale. We know the importance of Mark Twain, you know, from the Saatchi, etc. And I can give you, or Simon Buchel, who did show the boat that, Lampedusa boat at the Venice Biennale. And these kind of problematics are still present. So we are actually having this, that our students, undergraduate or even masters have in their curriculum learning about those not only unethical practices, which I mean this kind of hurts me the most, as I hate people who are, let's say, in the asylum process or who have been in asylum process being represented in that derogatory way. It's only that we have graduates who are actually, following the paths of those kind of well-known artists. And I think this is a huge problem here. So I would have, to be perfectly honest, I don't know of any good practices in terms of the work that shows representation or the work on refugees or direct provision or etc. I think the main issue that we have here in the visual arts discourse is that we are looking all the time for a face to be able to humanize. Do we really need a face to be able to humanize? Do we really need the bodies? Do we really need to see the dead body of Alan Kurdi washed to the Turkish shore to humanize? And then how many Alan Kurdis have drowned since that boy called Alan Kurdi? And then how do we negotiate that? So I think that voyeurism is extremely, extremely problematic. And I did suffer for those 10 years that I mentioned, because people who run the galleries have asked me in the South, have asked me, but where are the bodies here? We would like to see the bodies. And I did say, but there are no bodies, and you will not see the bodies. And I think it's getting really to that moment that I kind of will use perhaps something that I can within that kind of context of working with people in the process to literally bring that. And I think it's really important to give space and time for people who are in the system to practice art if they wish, and to learn. I think Justin gives a perfect example, and there are so many people like that. And I think to even question what is art and what is not art is deeply problematic. So I'm just, I was really this morning looking at your work, Justin, that I could find on Google, and I was like, wow, this is just great. And looking at your background, I think this is just phenomenal, So I think giving a platform to people to express themselves is crucially important. And yes, making aware arts councils through activism about their privileges and about them not doing their work properly is also important. It's up to us as well to do that.
I think Vukašin used this word humanizing. You need to have the body so that you're humanizing it. And I just wanted to second that. And there's always this question, but who for? Who am I doing this humanizing for? And it's, as Vukašin said, this imagined audience that is representative of white privilege. I think in the context of Ireland, I think it especially baffles me, this relationship when it happens. And when I say Ireland, I mean the island of Ireland, giving the still ongoing experience and fact of colonization, And so I think that there is something fascinating and fascinatingly troubling that has happened there, when you can have this in the Irish context as well, that we need to humanize through only engaging in traumatic representation of migrant and refugee experiences. And we have to do that because we're imagining those audiences who are coming to see that to not have shared that experience. I think that's the other part of equation that's happening there, that you're imagining that people who are coming to see that as a curator, you're imagining your audiences as not having that experience, at which point I question why, as a curator, a director, or gallery, you're not imagining people from migrant backgrounds as your audiences, and why the hell not? And how do you change that? Because God knows there's plenty of us who could be coming to see. And I know that plenty of us feel excluded as audiences and not just as artists. And I think there's this other point of art education that you mentioned, Vukašin, of what are the students being taught in institutions and who are they looking at, and how this circle of negative representation repeats itself. I think this also obviously has to do with who's teaching and how do we de-everything the curriculum, like decolonize, decentralize from white Western experiences and art practices and so on and so forth. But I think it also has to do, as a person who has done some teaching, I think it also has to do with how art and drama schools imagine what is teachable, and I think it falls into this highly institutionalized mainstream, let's look at what's at the Venice Biennale only category, or frequently it's like, let's look at applied context, but we separate applied art or art therapy, we separate it in this corner where real art practice, quote unquote, is not, and so I think there is also work that is being done in art schools to perpetuate this negative representation, and I think exclusion of migrants as well from art practice.
I think it's worth to note that the two most prominent responses to the work that we've had by Bojana in our current exhibition is the people who see themselves in it, people who are migrants, that they had never seen themselves represented in a gallery before, and they were really moved by it and felt so strongly that it was such a special feeling, and that was really awesome. And the other response has been from so many people who haven't had a migrant experience, where they had no clue that this was the day-to-day experience that migrants were facing, and it's been a huge catalyst for conversation and realization. Like a lot of people just going, oh, as the pennies dropping as to how the infrastructure of something as simple as the buses is impacting negatively on the migrants that are in this region. And I just felt that that's something worth noting. Justin, I wanted to ask, when you've been talking to the politicians in your role as chair or the various hats that you have had, what has the response been? Are you pushing at an open door? Have the politician and policymakers been positively responsive, and has it changed over time?
Yes, it's a very good question, because from the beginning, the first thing you receive as an answer is like, oh, we have people here struggling, we have people living in poverty, we have people it's difficult. So you always get this question first. So it was a case of acknowledging the sufferings of local people living here first, and then said, but these people came here in a very different circumstances, and the struggle is very difficult and is an ongoing struggle. And although people suffer here, there's some mechanism, there's some support around them to help them come out from, poverty. But the refugee or asylum seekers are maintaining to poverty, into destitution by the asylum immigration process itself, by not allowing them to work, but giving them a very, at the time it was £35, but I believe it's £37 something now, or £40, I don't know. Even children receiving £5 a day is not good. It's not humanly possible for people to live in this condition without getting help from somewhere, from church or local community support. So it was not easy, but, in all ways, when I approach politicians, I approach those who I think are more human than politicians. Understand? I don't know if I can explain myself well, but I try to look into the politicians, those who have the human side of the person. They don't have politics as a career. They're just human, try to make a difference. These are the people I target first, I make connection with, because I know they will go beyond the politics and look into the human aspect and be able to try to change, help them to change, make policy, change things. These were my approach. When I see politicians, I talk to them, I will be able to know if he's more human-led or he's a very politician. So then I can make my move and try to let them know, give them facts. Because when you talk to politicians, they want evidence. So I'll give them facts, and I have one of them particular, I'm not going to name here, but he was so human. He wanted to see the living condition of asylum seeker himself. So I spoke to two friends who were happy to let him come into the house. So he came in and he saw the dump, he saw the crowdness, he saw everything from the room. He started tweeting, post. He asked if he could post photos. And then when he went out, he became a champion for the cause. These are my technique I used at the time when I was, refugee, leading the refugee and asylum seeker. But I wanted to touch to the commission first because my time is coming up, so if possible. So as a commissioner now, it's just moving from advocating for a group of people living in Northern Ireland, let's say refugee and asylum seeker, to advocate for everyone in Northern Ireland, which is very interesting as well, because as a commissioner, you advocate, you monitor, you report, you advise government, you monitor human rights instruments, see how the country here or local government apply the human rights instrument when making laws or passing laws, and advise the government department on how different law could impact human rights. So I think for me now it's a bigger challenge because I'm representing everyone living in Northern Ireland. So how I can make an impact, changing life of, let's say, when it comes to abortion or gay right or LGBT right or migrant right or employment, all this type of thing, even policing, how to improve this thing, what will be my contribution? That's what I will be doing. And I'm looking forward to it, and it's very broad now. So yeah, we'll see how it goes.
Not a question, more of an observation. I'm just thinking about how amazing it is to have you working for people of Northern Ireland, because it really reframes this idea of what Northern Ireland is. And again, you see that very rarely. I think you see that very rarely. And it's not a question. I'm just thinking about how it's not a question. I'm just thinking about how I personally, as a white immigrant who again came here on a student visa, I so feel unrepresented in the Northern Irish system and in the English system as well, but in the Northern Irish system. So to actually see spaces opening up from people who arrived here and were not born here and are not part of the how Northern Ireland is imagined incorrectly, really, as this kind of British Irish space. I think I just want to say that I think I'm very excited for that.
Thank you very much. I think it's a big challenge. Like you said, that's what motivated me even when I was working with refugee and asylum seekers. Because when you are put into this position, you become like the face. So you need to make sure you do your utmost best, because if you fail somewhere, then it will give excuse for those who don't want migrant or BME to occupy high-level positions. So it's extremely difficult at the time, but it's challenging. But we opt to challenge. I always say, when you leave your country to come in another country, you are already a role model. You are the one who will make changes. Nobody can make change for you if you took the step to come here, because sometimes where we live as a migrants, people cannot imagine what we went through, what we're meeting every day. They take us for granted, but they don't understand there's a challenge every day, every minute we live, try to balance everything with the new life we live. So, well, I hope to be a good commissioner. Then it will open more doors and give confidence for local people or all institutions and all appointments to appoint BME people, migrants who have the capacities, who have the knowledge, because this is the difficulty we face. We have people among us who are very talented, we are very bright but because they try so hard and it's not opening, they just stop forcing, they just do what they're doing every day to just get a living. They're tired of trying to push the boundaries high. They'll stop. So I think if I'm able to achieve this in 3 years, if I'm able to have good feedback and represent everyone, including local and migrant, I think I will be proud of this journey.
I think that's a rather wonderful note to finish on. Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Justin.
Okay, bye-bye. Speak to
Bye.
you later. See you later. Bye-bye.
I'm thinking about the strategies for resistance and how to mobilize. I think that's kind of really important. What about you?
What are you thinking about strategies of resistance and ways to mobilize? Yeah.
Just really, whether it's a kind of visual arts discourse or, whether it's a positionality and precariousness of people who are really living in the system still, because I think in my work, I think it's a very blurred line, whether, this is art or whether I'm trying to, in my best of capacity, trying to make a system that is more transparent for people who are coming to Ireland to seek protection. And how do we move on from there?
I think I have a different, my struggle is opposite, because I often think I don't know if I can even dare call this in any way activist, because for me, I'm always concerned that I'm going into some space where, is it my space? Can I be here? But I think that there's also, one of my reactions to what you're saying is artists or activists who are working in between these fields, we don't have to be perfect, super people who do everything, I think for me, there's also a moment in which it's okay to say, well, this is now my art practice, but my art practice exists between art spaces and migrant spaces or refugee spaces. I wonder if as a migrant artist, there's also this pressure to do more than that. There's this idea of art practice will achieve all these things, and maybe that's an excuse. I don't know.
No, if I got this right, I think there is a kind of antagonisms there, and I've seen this loads with my colleagues who are in academia and they're kind of right and their position to even be involved, whether, let's say, solidarity groups or who do you speak for. I think that's really important. But I think the notion of the allies in the struggle is extremely important. I think that this comes with the nuances. And I think, again, the position of privilege. And when I say the position of privilege, I mean me being white, even in the asylum process was significantly different to experience of my comrades who were not white. So, and then I think it's also, I get caught by that because people say, okay, well, he has experienced direct provision, so therefore he is speaking from that position. But I don't think that, for example, the work I do is any more superior or more relevant than the work that any other people can do, right? Really, when it comes to art, I think for me, it's like really ethics. And I think it really comes to ethics. And particularly working with marginalized groups is a durational arts practice. And it's really saddened to see this kind of even Arts Council advertising, for like 6 months or even 1 year. And then you have artists who are literally parachuting into communities, right? Extracting the nectar, and they have to provide a report within 1 year. So they're under pressure and everything goes wrong,
People can't see us. I'm nodding so furiously. Yes, I think a lot of my practice is participatory in many ways, but I've also been on the receiving end of those kind of invitations. And the number of times I've said, but who's being paid? So for me, that's the first question. Like, you're going in, you're, as you said so eloquently, extracting the nectar. With migrancy, there's always this phrase, which I swear to God I have an allergic reaction to, of, we want to foreground migrant stories. And it's always like you're just extracting the narrative of people's lives for your own social and economic capital and cultural capital. And I think there's always this question of, are you co-creating with people? In which case, are those people also artists? In which case, how are you paying them for their time? Or are you presuming that there are people in this world for whom participation in your art practice is all the award that they need? And as you say, these are always people who are in some ways experiencing marginalization. And so for them, the time giving is more costly usually than even for the artist. I think there's also this in I would say Western Europe, there's this very detrimental idea of artists as the ultimate precariat of late capitalism, which is completely, I could argue against that for hours, just because artists, whatever their background, live in extreme precarity and financial instability. It allows them to forego exactly these ethics that Vukašin is talking about, because we are the most endangered and therefore we could not possibly endanger anyone. And it facilitates these horrible, unethical, amoral, institutionalized structures of participation that get passed on as inclusion. I think that's the other problem, that if I go and extract someone's stories of their marginalization, it is presented as exclusion, and those people whose stories have been extracted have not been included in the economic setup, they have not been included in the representational setup, they're just there as the object. They're the equivalent of the apple that someone paints, for all these artists institutions. The problem is, for institutions, this costs a lot. You want to do ethical participatory projects, they're the most expensive for them. Frequently, I think art institutions see community and participatory projects as cheap and easy and so rewarding to do. And I think that's a giant problem, that people are like, but that costs so much. I can't possibly pay all these people to extract their stories and so on. And I think that in the artistic community, there's this idea of what I need to have autonomy over my artistic process, that doesn't recognize that in participatory projects, it's not your artistic process, it's the process of everyone who's involved in it. Those are some of the thoughts I have on ethics of participation that include migrants, but not migrants only. Everyone. I think this is particularly, participation was kind of made up for art institutions to persuade themselves that they are doing work with marginalized communities while actually doing, I don't know, some kind of conscious bathing exercise. I don't know how else to call it.
Like doing art to people rather than with people.
I was once in a panel where someone, because a person who's thinking I respect quite a lot, said to me, why do we expect everyone to participate in art? We don't expect everyone to go to football matches. And if someone made me go see Manchester United, I'd be very annoyed. And I wanted to scream, like, we don't subsidize Manchester United. Well, I'm sure there is some way in which we do, but we don't have a whole department and a whole institution whose job is to give money to, quote, make great art for everyone, which I was for a really long time Arts Council England's tagline. So I think there's also the responsibility that comes with that kind of, I hate to say this, taxpayers commitment, but I think there's also sometimes we confuse art and culture with completely private entities and businesses that operate outside.
Vukašin, do you want to come back on anything that Bojana's just said?
No, I agree 100%. I think, that's it. I'm just really thinking a lot throughout my time here. And also, having been hassled a lot of time from the artists who wanted to do the work with people in direct provision in terms of giving them names and contacts and how can they infiltrate within the community and what is the easy way, how to do that. And I kind of may perhaps want to maybe conclude on, and even people, some that I have met over the almost 20 years time really mean good, but what it comes out is really terrible. And I remember this artist who actually got significant funding from the Arts Council just before the pandemic. He was asking me to give him the names of the contacts of the people who are living in various direct provision centers, and he wanted to interview me. And I said, so can you explain your project? And he says, well, this is the work. I got the show in one of the galleries in the west of Ireland, so I wanted to meet as many people as possible who are in the process, and I wanted to sit with them and I want to talk with them, and I'm going to have with me a little small cup, and I kind of wanted to collect their tears, right? And that's the true story. And I was shocked in a way, and then it kind of really ended. So he really thought that kind of exhibiting actual tears from the participants in the small cups in the gallery will be a solidarity, instead of thinking that process of re-traumatizing and literally asking people to cry is violation of anyone's right. And this is what we are against, if you know what I mean. And this is something that's really, and this is so, it has so many different layers. So how wrong is that? And how low can we go? Again, it comes to education, and this is really, really important. And also the people on the Arts Council who are decision makers, I think that there has to be some work done there as well. Thank you for having me, and a pleasure. I mean, and we can talk, continuously, but I really enjoyed this conversation. Thanks, Bojana, and thanks, Catherine.
Thank you both so much for joining. It's been really fantastic to be able to hear your conversations. So much more to discuss in the future, I think. So thank you all very much for your time and your insight.
Thank you so much from me as well, Vukašin. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you to all of our speakers in today's podcast, Bojana Janković, Vukašin Nedeljković, and Justin Kuoame. You can read more about each of the artists by following the links in this episode's description, and you can see documentation about Ballads of Rhinestones and Newcomers at ccadld.org/exhibitions. And thank you for listening.